What we're going to do this evening is start a new series, as I mentioned, on translation issues, where I can hopefully focus on the technical issues that sometimes come up when we're talking about some of the beliefs presented in the Bible or certain historical details. So there are some shows from which I can take clips where I've discussed some of these types of translation issues, which, as clips or as shows like this one, from maybe 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the translation issue involved, it'll be an easy way for me and you to help others who have these same questions about some of these translation issues or even new ones that will give everybody the essential grammatical information so that you understand why it reads that way, apart from interpreting the verse. Why is it translated the way that we're reading it? And so, for example, the first video in this series, which will be this one, is going to look at several texts actually, that use the singular noun tree or wood. In Greek, it's XULON. So it relates to the texts and the issues that I've been discussing that are involved with the condition of the dead, the resurrection. And so I don't want to have to revisit all of those issues again just to address this one issue that came up from a question I received on my Facebook page, or rather the CWJ Facebook page. Great question. Why is the singular noun XULON in Greek translated in the plural trees in versions like the NWT in text in Revelation 22? So I'm going to address that issue right out of the at the start of this video, and then I'm going to get into a couple interpretive related issues. And so at the start of each of these live streams or new videos I do on translation issues, I'm going to get right to the grammatical issue, and then I'll comment on how I understand the verse interpretively as it's connected with its immediate and larger context and biblical thought. And so that way, if you're only here for the grammatical stuff, you can get that right away, because that's what this series is going to be focused on, right? Why does the version we use read that way, and is it correct? What is correct? Is it singular tree or trees in Revelation 22? Well, let's take a look. So I'll go ahead and bring up the NWT. And as always, let me know how things are sounding and looking in the live stream. Just so as I get used to this new control room, I can see your questions if you have them, and continue to get used to the live feed and the way it's structured now. Okay, so the text we're going to look at, as I put in the description of this video, are in Revelation 22. There's 3 of them. And I put that in the description as well. So hopefully you had a chance, to look at them. And the 3 texts are Revelation 22:2, 22:14, and 22:19. All right, so let's take a look at those 3 verses. I'm not going to get into the full contextual reading. I'll do that next. But let's read those 3 texts, because those are our subject text, really, when it comes to the translation of XULON, the Greek noun, often translated tree or wood, but it can also have a more collective use, like more pieces of wood, like in Acts 16 when XULON is used for the stocks that held the prisoner, obviously more pieces of wood than one. Or even when in the New Testament XULON is used for the execution instrument of Jesus. If you understand that to be a cross, right, more than one piece of wood, then again, that would be a collective use when XULON is used in the singular for the cross. Now I'm going to do a separate show on XULON and stauros for the execution instrument that is used in reference to Jesus, but that's going to be separate based on the usage of those terms versus the use of XULON in the singular or the plural for what is basically universally accepted as a tree, a reference to a tree in these three texts. Whereas XULON and Stelros, that's the whole issue, right? What do they refer to? What can we look to in the context? We know what the words can mean, but what do they mean based on what we can read? Here we have a singular and whether or not it should be translated as a plural. And if so, why? Okay, so let's take a look. Revelation 22:2. Again, I'm doing this as a follow-up to the discussion we just had, the last live stream, which talked about a lot of these things, the last several actually, but also to start a new series of translation issues so that, thank you for the notification, Betsy, so that I can, again, put together clips from other shows or create new videos that specifically address your questions about more technical grammatical issues and try to simplify them so it's clear, right? The idea, the goal is to get understanding, not to have some special knowledge that nobody can attain and we can't communicate, right? That's not in any respect what we seek. So if people know what they claim to know, then they should be able to show and explain the things they claim to know about, right? We're not perfect. We don't know everything, but to the extent that we do, we should be able to show the understanding we have, right? Give a defense, like Peter said, in some respect, depending on who we're talking to. Now, I got a question on the CWJF Facebook page, as I mentioned. Very great question, actually, I think. And that's why I decided, not only to answer the question, but also because of its relationship to the videos I've just done and because I want the information to be available, just start a new series, right? So translation issues number 1, Revelation 22, and the use of tree or trees, the Greek word XULON. Now, in all three texts, it is the singular of the term used, XULON. There's no dispute, right? There's no difference in the Westcott and Hort text and Nestle-Aland or United Bible Society's text, or even in just notes, variant readings. There may be, in some manuscripts, but basically there's no real issue with the text. Now, there's one part of verse 19 that if you're using the Textus Receptus, it doesn't say from the tree, it says from the book of life instead of from the tree of life. But that's based on an early transmission error from the Latin. I believe it's lignos, tree, that got translated or converted to libros, book in Latin. And then through Erasmus transmission of his text, the Textus Receptus ended up with that error. Or it's believed to be an error based on the fact that no early Greek manuscripts of Revelation contain the reading from the book of life in verse 19, but rather the tree of life. So that might be one issue if your English translation is based on the Textus Receptus in verse 19. Otherwise, let's take a look at the use of the singular for tree in these three texts. Okay, so verse 2. Well, verse 1, just because it's directly connected, but we're not going to read the context of every verse in between those three right now, as I mentioned. We'll do that next. And he showed me a river of water of life, clear as crystal, flowing out from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of its Broadway. Okay, now we're in verse 2, the first occurrence of our subject term, XULON, in Greek. Let's see how the NWT translates the singular term. It's a singular in form, but again, it could be in some sense a collective use, like I mentioned earlier. Still, let's take a look. And on this side of the river, and on that side, there were trees of life, plural, trees. And even with the plural verb in brackets to make it grammatically consistent, producing 12 crops of fruit, yielding their fruits each month. And the leaves of the trees, there's actually two occurrences in verse 2, but there's three subject texts, so it's not the number of trees. In both, it's the singular, XULON. And as you notice, the NWT uses the plural and also gives a plural verb in brackets to create grammatical consistency. Because that they understand XULON, as I'm going to show, as a collective term. And I'm going to argue that at least in this verse, they are correct. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that translations that use a singular here are incorrect. I'm going to show you what I mean by that in a moment further. Well, we'll just talk about it now. So when it says on this side of the river and on that side, the Greek word is entuthen. And so it means on each side, not in the river, right? If it wanted to say that, it says right here that the river is flowing in the middle of the broad way from the throne of God and of the Lamb. So the word middle is not too far from the next sentence, but it doesn't say that the tree or trees, we'll leave that open for now, is in the middle of the river. It says the tree or trees are or is on each side, on this side and on that side. So if there's the singular is used, tree of life, right here. But the tree of life is on both sides of the river. So it doesn't say the tree is growing from one side of the river over to the other. It says the tree of life, it specifies it, is on this side and it's on that side. That's why the NWT uses trees here, because it's collectively referring to, and I believe correctly, the tree of life that is on this side and the tree of life that is on that side. There's at least two trees. Or the tree of life is growing out. It doesn't say this, but I'm just, if it's not that, then what are we saying, right? We have to kind of go beyond that and look to the tree as coming out from the throne of God and of the Lamb and kind of growing alongside along each side of the river. But it doesn't say that. It says on this side and on that side, the tree of life produces fruit. And the leaves, it makes a distinction. I think this is important. Yielding their fruits, 12 crops of fruit. But then it goes on in the very last part of the text, the first of our three subject texts in Revelation 22, to say the leaves of the trees, or of the tree is what it says literally. But again, if collectively, because it anaphorically is referring to what it immediately preceded, right? I mean, by anaphoric, I mean the preceding reference is the tree of life that's on this side and on that side. And so collectively here, trees is correct. You could also say, as most English translations say, all the ones I checked, you could say on this side of the river and on that side, a tree of life or the tree of life is producing crops of fruit. So it's still going to be more than one tree of life, because referentially, the location specified for the tree is more than one. They're not the same location. So there has to be more than one tree, just based on the reference made clear in the text, apart from any collective reference, right? That's why I say you could say singular or plural. So I think NWT is okay here. It gets a little bit more involved, because I think this is enough to make it plain. There's more than one tree here. But I don't think this is not incorrect. It just gets more involved. You have to start making the verbal connections consistent. All right, so in this case, I believe that this here, entuthen, makes it clear there's more than one tree of life here. And this tree of life yields fruit. And the leaves of the trees cure the nations. Very important for our discussion of the context after this grammatical discussion. All right, let's take a look at verse 14. Happy are those who wash their robes, that the authority to go to the trees of life may be theirs, and that they may gain entrance into the city by its gates. Who is this referring to? Well, I mean, who else is said to wash their robes? Who else might need to gain entrance into the city? Sounds like people outside the city. Kind of sounds like the nations, the great crowd that come out of the Great Tribulation, that wash their robes and make them white in the blood of the Lamb. The nations up here, this is my interpretation, but just to connect it real quick, who are cured by the leaves growing from the trees along each side of the river. All right, so it again uses trees here in the NWT, but in the Greek, it is the singular noun xylon, tree. But it can also be used collectively, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's with regard to stocks, like in Acts 16, or to the execution instrument. If you see that as a cross, I'm not going to get into that right now. My point is those who do basically are seeing that as a collective use of xylon and stauros, unless it's in the plural, but they're not, so it's used singularly, and so it would be collective in that sense, similar to what we're talking about now. Okay, but in verse 14, it doesn't give any qualifying reference. Nevertheless, it could be consistent with verse 2, and if so, if it's the same reference, right, to the trees on each side of the river, then this is okay. Trees is okay, even though it's the singular xylon. Okay, our last subject text on the grammatical discussion part, verse 19. And if anyone takes anything away from the words of the scroll of this prophecy, God will take his portion away from the trees, or tree, it's the singular xylon, unless you're using a version based on the Textus Receptus, as I mentioned, from the trees of life and out of the holy city. This is important for our discussion after this grammatical part. Things which are written about in this scroll. Okay, so again, NWT uses trees. The question is, who is this referring to? Right? Is this referring to the same people in verse 14 and verse 2? Or just to verse 2? Portion away from the trees of life, best reading, most attested in the early Greek manuscripts, and out of the holy city. We'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, let me share with you at least one source that agrees with me and with the NWT when it comes to translating the singular xylon as trees in a collective sense. And I would argue, just based on the reference, even if you translate it in the singular, you'd have to have more than one tree of life according to verse 2. But I'm going to share with you a quotation from the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, Volume 5, in the discussion of the term we're talking about, xylon, by J. Schneider, on page 42. It says, under number 5, on page 40, in several verses, cites Revelation 2:7, 22:2, 14:9. We're going to get to Revelation 2:7, our discussion after this part. Revelation speaks of the xylon tes zoes, the tree of life, or a tree of life. According to 2:7, this tree is in the heavenly paradise of God. Now, it doesn't say heavenly in Revelation 2, but I think that may be correct based on what we're going to read in a moment. And it does say paradise, similar to Jesus' use of paradise in Luke 16, for the spirit that returns to the God who gave it and sleeps with him, like in Abraham's bosom. There is a sort of a unique reference in paradise that I think applies to verse 7, similar to Luke 16, that we'll talk again further about in a moment. But it says, okay, so it says then 22:2 tells us that trees, that's how it renders it, trees of life, stand on both banks of the river in the heavenly Jerusalem. And then it has a note right after it says Revelation 22:2 tells us that trees, just like the NWT, of life stand on both sides of the river. The note, note 18, says in Revelation 22:2, xylon is collective. Okay, so, I like to at least give one source if possible that when I'm talking about a grammatical issue, unless, it's just overwhelmingly clear, can also be cited to support what I'm talking about and what I think is clear especially when you consider en tooth then in verse 2, on each side of the river. Okay, so that's why trees is okay in the NWT in Revelation 22. I think it's absolutely appropriate in verse 2. Not necessary, but you would definitely have then, if you said tree of life on each side of the river, if you didn't come away with the understanding there's more than one tree, I think then the singular tree would be more problematic than trees, at least in verse 2. Verse 14 and verse 19 are a little bit different, and unless they relate directly to the same tree in verse 2, I'm not so sure I would use the plural in those two texts. But I think Revelation 22:2 is appropriate, just like Schneider in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament also believes. And that's for reasons stated, specifically the use of en tooth then on each side of the river. All right, now let's go back a little bit. Let's go back and we're going to read a few texts. And so if you don't want to hear any interpretations and how I connect some of these things as a follow-up to our last show, no problem. You can go. But I'm not going to spend too much time because I think we've talked a lot about most of these sections of texts. But I'm going to add a few more to what we've read. And I'm going to connect a few more dots to what we've already put together. At least as far as what I think is a reasonable working model for interpreting the various states of death and resurrection and the conditions that will exist in different places, whether you're in heaven or in the New Jerusalem, or as we see with the nations on the earth. And we'll see that further in a moment. Okay, let me get my reading voice ready. Let's go to Revelation 2. We talked about and read from Schneider, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, how they see the tree of life here as in the heavenly paradise of God. And I think that's it's probably correct. It doesn't say that right. It just says in the paradise of God, verse 7. Let the one who has an ear hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. To him that conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life. Singular. NWT reads singular here. XULON. Which is in. Here we get a location, right? I mean, we got locational information in Revelation 22:2 as well. Because if there's a river flowing down the broad way from the throne of God and the Lamb, and there's sides along each river producing actual trees that produce fruit with leaves and that heal the nations, well, that sounds pretty earthly to me, even if it's a different type of earth, right? We're talking about the new earth. We're not talking about the same earth we're in now. So here, it doesn't describe the tree there, right? It doesn't talk about it here along the river, each side of the river. Here it says specifically, in the paradise of God. And we know that, the things we have here are in some sense related to the things there. And so it shouldn't be a big surprise, right? There are different things. Even Jesus says that in John 14, he describes how he's going away to what? Prepare a place, prepare a room for his disciples, and he'll come again and then take them home to himself. Where did Jesus say he would that Abraham was in the illustration that showed him sleeping with God? In paradise, right? Or in a condition like paradise. And so you could see that as a heavenly reference, especially in this context, because he's talking about Christians who, as I'm going to show now, are ruling with him over the earth. It doesn't necessarily mean they can't be on the earth as well, right? Come down from heaven, out of New Jerusalem, onto the earth. But maybe they can. Let's find out. All right, so Revelation 2:7, I wanted to share that so that at least we have the reference to the other tree of life and it being in the paradise of God. So it's not described in the same way as Revelation 22. Although maybe one or two of those, or even all three, refer to the same tree, right? It's possible. But it's not necessary. There's clearly a descriptive difference and a contextual referential difference. I mean, here he's directly referring to people in other ways that speak of them being with him in heaven. I'm going to show you. Let's jump down to verse 26, 27. I'm not going to read every text because, there's so much else that comes up. I'm going to get to the key parts that relate to our subject and how we tie this all up. Tree of life, trees of life. Where is it? Who eats of it? Where are they when they eat from it? Well, let's talk a little bit more about it and we'll wrap this up. So we discussed the translation issue. I believe that's clear, at least in terms of how you can understand the plural and the singular for XULON in Revelation 22. Now we can see that there's another reference to the tree of life in the paradise of God, and to the same people he described that tree to. In verse 26, he says, and to him that conquers, right? Same thing he said to verse 7, the one that conquers, to him that conquers. So anyone who conquers is going to do that. Verse 26, anyone who conquers, to him that conquers, and observes my deeds down to the end, right? What did the master come back to see if the slave was doing? What he said, what he told him to do, take care of his domestics, right? Feed them at the proper time. Make sure everything goes well while I'm gone. Observe what I tell you all the way to the end. And what? I will give you authority over nations. Not you are the nations, or to him that conquers and observes my deeds down to the end among the nations. I'm going to give you authority over the nations. The same nations that we read about in Revelation 22 who are cured by the leaves growing from the trees, or the tree on each side of the river, and so more than one tree. Verse 27, and he, okay, so he's given authority over nations to do what? Shepherd the people with an iron rod, so that they will be broken to pieces like clay vessels, the same as I have received from my Father. This is these are the nations, the sheep, the people who came through the great tribulation. We're going to show that even further. Well, Revelation 7 talks about it, but we'll get to it again in another section. The ones who didn't know they were treating the Christians in the way that they really were. They may have thought, they may have hoped, but Jesus knew, and they didn't. And the ones being persecuted knew, and they didn't. And that's why they asked Jesus, when did we see you like this? And he tells them. And even if we went out and told everyone right now, they just think, oh yeah, sure you believe that. But once it really happens, they're going to realize after he tells them, that's what happened. You did this, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the founding of my Father. That's the nations who are going to be shepherded by those who conquer, the Christians, who are either caught away or resurrected, who are sleeping in death when all of these things occur, when the end of the harvest arrives, before at the start of the 1,000 years. So they'll be shepherding those nations, right? They're going to be given authority to bring them into the new earth before the final judgment and before the testing by Satan. These are the people from whom many will fall at the end. But they're going to be shepherded and guided. They're not going to be left alone, right? They're going to be prepared. There's not going to be any excuse then. Here there is. They don't even know what they're doing. They're being beaten with fewer strokes. Remember what we read? These are those nations who nonetheless did the right things and are considered sheep in comparison to the goats when it comes to those who do the will of God's Father. They know what they're doing. Sheep don't. And that's why they're being shepherded, right? The sheep are shepherded by those who rule with Christ and who sit down on his Father's throne. Let's go to Revelation 3, verse 2. Notice what he says here. It's very similar to what? The master. Matthew 24, Luke 12. The master and the faithful and discreet slave. Become watchful. Strengthen the things remaining that were ready to die. For I have not found your deeds right? He comes back and sees that you're mistreating the domestics. The deeds are not done right. Here they're not fully performed in the sight of his God. Verse 3, therefore continue mindful of how you have received and how you heard, and go on keeping and repent. Right? They're making mistakes. They're not the full wicked slave yet, but they're in trouble, right? The master is telling them, unless you wake up, what? I shall come as a thief. That's exactly what he said in Matthew 24, 25, Luke 12, when he compared his coming to a thief. It's the same thing. So much of this is the same as what we read in Matthew 24, 25, and Luke 12. And he even says, you will not know at all what hour I shall come. What did he say in Matthew? Nobody knows, not the Son, but only the Father. And then let's just read a couple more. He says, nevertheless, you have a few names in Sardis that did not defile their outer garments, right? They shall walk with me in white ones because they are worthy. Verse 5, he that conquers will thus be arrayed in white outer garments. Doesn't say they'll wash them, but it does say, in fact, even here it says these people didn't defile them, so they wouldn't need to be washed. These people needed to be washed, though, but not in the way that the nations collectively appear to be washing their robes after the tribulation, right? That's after. So they're the ones who don't know. These are the ones who do know. That's why he's talking to them this way. It wouldn't make sense for him to talk to the people who don't know what he's talking about in Matthew 25 and ask him, Lord, when did we see you? Right? That's why he's telling them, if you don't wake up, I'm going to come as a thief, and you won't know at what time I'm coming. Nevertheless, you had a few that did not defile their outer garments. They'll walk with me in white ones. He that conquers will thus be arrayed. And notice, I will by no means blot out his name from the book of life, but I will make acknowledgement of his name before my Father and before his angels. Right there. So we're at the end of the harvest where the Son of Man arrives and all the angels with him. Those who are alive in union with Christ, after those who are dead in union with Christ are resurrected, are caught away to be with him. The sheep and the goats are judged. The sheep go into the new earth after the great tribulation. So all these things apply at the same time, just to different people. The dead, those who are alive as Christians, those who are alive who were good to the Christians, and the goats, the ones who opposed the Christians or who just didn't care about anything or anyone, at least the way that mattered. Either way, they can decide who they are based on how they act, since that's how we'll all be judged. Right? I've not found your deeds fully performed before my God. What we do is important. What they do is important. All right, let's jump down to verse 10. Now let's read verses 10 through 22. Listen to this very carefully. I know you always listen carefully, but I'm going to highlight it again because there's so much going on here. Verse 10, because you kept the word about my endurance, I will also keep you from the hour of test. Remember I said we'd talk about the tribulation. Listen to this. I will also keep you from the hour of test, which is to come upon the whole inhabited earth, to put a test upon those dwelling upon the earth. Who comes out of the great tribulation? The ones who haven't washed their robes yet. The sheep who don't know that they're doing the right things because they're following the law of their heart and treating Christ's brothers, those who do the will of his Father, rightly. He's talking here about those who are caught away. So there's a period of him returning, them being resurrected and caught away, the Christians, and then the judgment of the sheep and the goats, right? You have that. There's obviously this all happened simultaneously. There's a slight buildup of, they even said that the heavenly bodies would flee, just like Revelation says in Matthew, because the Son of Man would arrive in his glory and everyone would see, just like lightning comes out of the east and shines over the west. Remember, we read that in our last video. So it's talking about the same thing and different people going through or being saved from the same thing. And that's why it's sometimes like, well, who's he talking to? Even Peter, remember? yesterday in our last live stream? Are you talking to us or are you talking to everyone? And he didn't even really answer him, right? He didn't say, well, no, I'm talking to you, not them. They're this. He just said, look, who really is? Well, we're going to find out who I'm talking about. Because everybody's going to be judged based on what they choose to do. We come face to face with what each one chose to do. Everyone, all of us, those who are dead in union with Christ, those who are caught away to be in union with Christ, he's talking to them right here. Verse 11, I'm coming quickly. Keep holding fast with you what you have, that no one may take what? Your crown. Who has a crown? Kings have a crown. Verse 12, the one that conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will by no means go out from it anymore. And I will write upon him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which descends out of heaven from my God, and that new name of mine. Now, this is what I meant earlier when I kind of suggested whether or not those who are in, the heavens, in the paradise of God with that tree of life, Revelation 2:7, could come out of heaven and, be involved on the earth and be, partake of the fruit of those trees. Or is it possible the fruit from those trees is brought into New Jerusalem to them? Because here it says they don't go out from the temple of God anymore. They're made a pillar. Now, in Revelation 7, it also refers to the great crowd as serving him day and night in his temple, and he spreads his tent over them, similar to the language used in Revelation 21 about the new heavens, new earth, and the mankind. So the temple of God is seen as not always a specific, restricted location in the new heavens and new earth. It's all there in a way that fits with these descriptions. But I would be careful to limit, take it too literal, and to say that they can't actually leave the heavenly temple. I'm not going to say they can, because this says they by no means go out from it anymore. They're made a pillar in it. But then there are other texts that refer to the kings of the earth bringing the glory of the nations into the city. And so, depending on how you interpret the kings of the earth in that text, we'll get to it, that could either be the kings, the people of the nations who were made kings during the 1,000 years, or these kings who are taking the fruit from the trees growing on each side of the river, leaving the leaves for the nations. Verse 13, let him that has an ear hear. Verse 14, to the angel of the congregation in Laodicea write, these are the things the Amen says, faithful and true witness, beginning of the creation by God. I know your deeds. Listen to this, that you're neither hot nor cold. I wish you were hot or else cold or else hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth. What does that sound like? To me, when I read that as a follow-up to our last show, that sounds like the slave with one talent who took it and hid it because he thought the worst of his master and then didn't make anything from it, and then brought it back to him and made it seem like because his master was so bad that he didn't want to risk losing it, right? Not even to put it into a bank where he could make some interest, probably more back then than now. That's what that reminds me of, right? You're neither hot nor cold. You're lukewarm. You didn't do anything with that talent I gave you. What about the next verse, verse 17? What does this sound like? Because you say, I am rich and have acquired riches and do not need anything at all. But you do not know you are miserable and pitiable and poor and blind and naked. What does that sound like to you? Well, if you watched our last video, you know that's the man who had a field that was producing so much. He thought to himself, I have enough. I have this great field. I'm going to tear down the storehouses I have, and I'm going to build bigger ones. And I'm going to make them so full, I don't have to do anything for years. Is that not who this is? I'm rich and I have acquired riches and I don't need anything at all. I have this field. I have these big storehouses I built now. I'm good. I don't need anything. Right? Of course you do. You don't realize that's not what is going to last. Why? Because if you're not rich toward God, when your riches here fail, you don't have anything. What? You're miserable, pitiable, poor, naked, blind. That's what he means. He's not being mean. He's saying you're putting your faith in riches. He's talking about these Christians just like he was in the text in Matthew 24, 25, and Luke 12 that we read in our last show. So he goes on to say, I advise, this is the being rich toward God part. I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire, that you may become rich, and white outer garments, that you may become dressed. Right? See, they're not told to wash their robes here. They're told to buy their robes from him, and that the shame of your nakedness may not become manifest, and eye salve to rub in your eyes that you may see. That's so he's here descriptively saying the same thing he said in our last reading and show, the text we read, that those who are not rich toward God have nothing when your end comes. Because when your physical end comes and all your riches are gone, if you don't have anything from God, if you don't have these things, you're gone. Verse 19, all those for whom I have affection I reprove and discipline, therefore be zealous and repent. Verse 20, our last text in this section, I am standing at the door and knocking. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into his house and take the evening meal with him and he with me. Actually, we'll read through verse 22. To the one that conquers, I will grant to sit down with me on my throne. Where, as we read in Revelation 22, where are the trees of life? They're on each side of the river. Where does the river come from? From the throne of God and the Lamb. Where do these people sit? To the one that conquers, I will grant to sit down with me on my throne, even as I conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. So, let's now go to Revelation 21 and 22. If they conquer and sit down with him on his Father's throne in the paradise of God, if that's where it is, that's in heaven, because it's differentiated, or at least it's in the city that comes down from heaven, right? Because that city has a river, according to what we read in verse 22, verse 1, a river of water of life, clear as crystal, flowing out from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Where the people who we just read about, who are going to eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God, are sitting. They're sitting here in the same place that God and the Lamb are, where their throne is. He just said that. So the question is, do they get the fruit? Do they eat from the tree of life that's in this paradise, that's growing on each side of the river that flows out of their throne? And it's being brought into them because they don't go out from the temple anymore. They're pillars in the temple of their God. Let's take a look at a couple texts preceding this part. The question is the paradise of God from Revelation 2:7, from which those who conquer and sit on the throne of the Lamb and of God, and who rule over the nations, all that we read, is that tree of life in the paradise of God where the throne of God and the Lamb are? Or is it here in this paradise that grows out from the river of life that flows from the throne and from the city that comes down out of heaven? Revelation 21. We're going to read a few more verses, then we'll wrap it up. If you have any questions, you can put them down, but I think everything's been pretty clear so far. Nevertheless, not all of it's easy, I understand. We definitely covered the XULON singular part, I think, well, so hopefully you have enough understanding to deal with that. 22:2 is the key in terms of explaining more than one tree. And so now, Revelation 21, 9 through 27. Listen to this. It's very important. It all is. But we're trying to focus on specific parts of these accounts that help us gain a clearer understanding of what this tree is about, where it is, who partakes of it, And can it be more than one location? And can people in more than one location be partaking of it? Revelation 21:9, and there came one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, which were full of the 7 last plagues, and he spoke with me and said, "Come here, and I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." Verse 10, so he carried me away in the power of the Spirit to a great and lofty mountain, and he showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, and having the glory of God. Its radiance was like a most precious stone, as a jasper stone shining crystal clear. And then it goes on to describe the walls, the gates, and it says that it has the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. I'm not going to get into the 144,000 or the text in Revelation 7 and 14 that speak further about these 12 tribes, but I am going to do a separate show on that. Okay, so let's set that aside for now. We can only do so much, and I want to keep this as focused on the tree of life as possible, since that's the translation issue that starts, that really is the focus of the show. But interpretively, the second part of these translation issues videos, I'm open to considering the extended understanding of the terms and the grammatical understanding that we achieve after we're done with the first part. All right, so we established XULON and what it can mean, and the plural versus the singular. Now we're talking about some of the context that describes where this tree is, who eat it, and where they are. So goes on to describe, he's showing him what? He said right here in verse 9, the bride, the Lamb's wife. And then he goes on to show him what? Show me the holy city coming down of heaven from God that has all these things, including the names of the apostles, the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There are 12 angels at the gates. He talks about the foundation stones, the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. He measures the city. Talks about the cubits being 144 cubits, according to a man's measure and the angel's measure. We'll talk about that in our 144,000 show. Then he gets into verse 19 or verse 18. He talks more about the structure of the city, pure gold, foundations of the city. He's talking about the bride, right? The Lamb's wife. Talks about the different stones. Talks about the pearls, the pearly gates. And then verse 22. I did not see a temple in it, for Jehovah God the Almighty is its temple, also the Lamb. So, remember when we read earlier about how those who eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God are made a pillar in the temple of Jesus God, and they don't go out from the temple anymore? Here it says there is no temple, because God is its temple and also the Lamb. And so in other words, we have to be careful how we interpret that restrictive movement inside the temple, whether it's in Revelation 2 and 3 regarding those who eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God, or Revelation 7, right, where it says those over whom God spreads his tent serve him day and night in his temple. Because if we are not careful, we're going to think of that temple as only in the heavenly presence of God. And here it says there is no actual temple, but there is God and the Lamb. And so wherever they are, and it says that he will be with us, wipe every tear from their eyes. So the association between God and the Lamb as our temple is sufficient to use as an interpretation for these other temple texts. I still encourage you to be careful and not make too much of it. And that's kind of why I'm making more out of this text here, so you understand the use and description of temple in Revelation. We'll do a separate show on that. Verse 23, and the city has no need of the sun nor of the moon to shine upon it, for the glory of God lighted it up, and its lamp was the Lamb. Just like in Matthew 25, when the Son of Man arrives, you don't need any other light. And that's how everyone there is going to see the sign of the Son of Man. Here, that's not what we're seeing because we're past that point. We still don't need those lights because we have the glory of God and the Lamb. Notice verse 24. He's talking about the bride, right? He's talking about the city doesn't have need for these things because God and the Lamb are in that city. He's describing the bride of the Christ. But then in verse 24, look at what he says. And the nations will walk by means of its light. And the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will not be closed at all by day, for night will not exist there. And they, the kings of the earth, the nations, and kings of the earth here is either the kings we've been talking about, who are on the throne of God and the Lamb, and because there is no actual temple like we read right here, but God and the Lamb are, those kings as pillars in that temple that's not there, but that is there because of them being there, they very well could be kings who go to the earth from the city and bring the glory of the nations, which is the tree's fruitage that they either collect or that's there, right? I mean, they're eating the leaves. It says that explicitly in Revelation 22, right here, 22:2. So who's eating the fruit? If the nations are being cured by the leaves of the tree or trees, and if the nations are not the bride of Christ, it says it differentiates them right here. The city has no need for these things. This is that city, the holy city coming down out of heaven, the bride of Christ. The nations walk by means of that city's light. It comes down out of heaven. So if it's coming down out of heaven, where's it going? It's coming to the earth, is it not? The holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. Not in heaven. It's a heavenly city, obviously, right? I mean, you can see all this description here, certainly consistent with descriptions of heavenly things, given for what is also associated with Jehovah and his spiritual realm. And it's differentiated. It's a place that you can look into and see or not see things, people or temples. Doesn't need to have these things because they're in it. The nations are being lit up by it. The kings on the earth, says that right here, bring glory into the city because its gates are not closed. They bring their glory and the honor of the nations into it. So I don't find anything inconsistent with the reference in Revelation 2 to the tree of life and the paradise of God. With the trees of life that are described here as on each side of the river that flows from the throne of God and the Lamb, on which are those who have conquered and who are given authority over these nations as the bride of Christ that comes down out of heaven and that provides all these things, including light, and that either those appointed among the nations as kings or the kings who are ruling with God and the Lamb on his Father's throne, those kings come out of the city and bring the glory of the nations into the city. It says, not anything not sacred, and anyone that carries on a disgusting thing and a lie will not enter into it. Remember, Satan does what at the end of the 1,000 years? He goes and surrounds this city. So no one that he misleads is getting in here, but he's going to mislead people. And at some point, they're not going to get in here. Only those who continue to do, who are shepherded by those who rule with Christ on his Father's throne the way a shepherd shepherds sheep and does what? Breaks clay vessels to pieces. Because if they do these things, they're going to be broken literally. The kings of the earth, the kings who are ruling with Jesus and his Father, aren't going to tolerate that. And whether these kings are kings appointed among the nations or the very same kings that rule the nations, right? They're given authority over the nations. Revelation 3:21, sitting down on his Father's throne with the Lamb. From that throne is a river of water of life. And on each side of that throne, of that river flowing from that throne, are trees of life. Or a tree of life is on each side, and so trees of life. And the leaves of those trees cure the nations. So I hope this discussion has given some clarity. I know these texts are not all, super clear, and some of them do require further discussion in ways that can at times make it seem like we can't really figure it all out. And that's okay. We don't have to figure everything out. As long as it's consistent enough when we put what we do understand together. And I think most of it does fit together. And maybe over time, as we spend more time really thinking about it and the things that are said, apart from some of the interpretations others have made us consider, maybe if we just devote our attention to the text, make legitimate connections like we've done, I believe, then the rest that may not seem clear will become clear. But I do believe what is clear is that there are trees of life. And whether or not there's a tree of life in the city, or whether or not the fruit from the trees of life outside the city, on each side of the river, are brought into those who are with God, in the sense that Jesus is talking about in Revelation 2, 3, the ones that conquer and sit on his Father's throne with him, I don't really see a big problem. If they're going to eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God, well, this describes trees of life producing fruit in a paradise. And if the fruit from these trees is brought into New Jerusalem so that they can eat it inside the city, the heavenly city that comes down out of heaven but that's still heavenly in all of its descriptions and functions, you have to get, it's not, the access to the city is not the same as what's happening outside of it. Well, then they're still eating that fruit in the paradise of God if that paradise is with him. Because the tree of life is just giving the fruit. And so they're still eating from the tree of life wherever it is, as long as they're eating from the fruit wherever they are. So I believe it's more consistent than it may seem at first glance when you compare texts like Revelation 2:7 and these texts in Revelation 22. So I would say probably as a good model of interpretation going forward, try not to focus too much on this tree of life in Revelation 2 in a heavenly sense. It might be easier to think of that as the result of the trees of life growing on the new earth. That the kings in that new earth bring into the city. If by this is meant they bring the glory of the nations in terms of the fruit being produced that's described later in these texts, well, then that's okay. I see that as consistent because they're still in the paradise of God eating from the tree of life. And it says the nations eat from the leaves of those trees. So something seems to be separated and reserved for those who eat the fruit. At least that's how it seems to me. Again, as Christian witnesses of Jah, we're curious about these things. We enjoy the texts. And obviously we care about everything in the biblical and related texts that speak of Jehovah, his son, whom we believe is the Messiah, and the things that those who followed them did and taught. Just because we have three things we put above everything else doesn't mean we don't consider the meaning of everything else. So you can only really present so much one time. And even though I think we've achieved a relatively clear understanding of these things, the tree of life, trees of life, where it is and how it relates to the different conditions in terms of a paradise of God, it's easier to focus on the three. So, but nevertheless, these things come up. We don't want to be unprepared. I still will put the three above all else, but I will do videos about translation issues and discussions about context and interpretation so that we understand all of these important texts while we're giving our primary attention to the three most important things.